Hello, friends, and welcome back to another episode of the Liberty Weekly podcast. I'm your host, as always, Patrick McFarland, and this one is episode 142. The show notes may be found at libertyweekly.net/142. And I'm very happy to be joined today by Scott. His Twitter handle is MDVet for Peace. The handle is MDVet4, and I'll put that in the show notes page as well. And so Scott reached out on Twitter after he saw my last episode with Kyle, and I had mentioned that I have been really into watching interviews with vets, and so he came out and had an awesome list of all these documentaries and stuff that are really awesome and that I'm going to check out. But we just figured we both were free today, and so we jump on and record an episode. So, Scott, welcome to the show. Thanks for reaching out.
Hi, Pat. Yeah, I really appreciate it. I was listening to you and I was like, oh my God, I have to tell him about it. I hope he gets this. And then it's just fortuitous you had the time. So
Yeah, and that's how these things work. So you had tweeted that video by Eugene Sledge, his talk at a Mises conference, and that was so cool because I watched the Pacific, and I came across just by chance I YouTube Eugene Sledge, and he spoke at a Mises event. How cool is that?
Yeah, it blew my mind. It was so cool when I discovered. So like for me, I saw the Pacific and then I picked up his book, and it was a really great read. It's a real page turner. It's called his is With the Old Breed, right? Or was it Helmet for My Pillow? There were two books they used as source material.
I think it's With the Old Breed.
Yeah.
Unless that was Sid Phillips.
Yeah, but that's right. It was with the Old Breed by Eugene Sledge, and I picked that up and I ripped through it, and then at some point, way down the line, I was before this was before I discovered Mises. This is when the Pacific came out 12 years ago or whatever. And then way down the line, I'm just like listening to anti-war stuff from Mises Institute, and I come across him, and man, that speech, that particular talk he gave, just like it'll rip your guts out, parts of it.
Yeah. Well, in seeing what he went through in the Pacific, I know there's some artistic creativity that goes with it as well, but especially when he directs that mortar team to fire on the house. And he goes back through the for those of you who aren't familiar, this is the Pacific. It's like Band of Brothers, made by the same people. It's a miniseries that HBO did, and of course it focused on World War II in the Pacific. But one of the main protagonists is a real vet named Eugene Sledge, and he's on a mortar team, and he goes through. He was the big thing was Okinawa, wasn't it? And one was Peleliu.
Really got serious for him.
Yeah.
Right. Kind of ground him down.
And so he really changed, throughout that. And he dealt with a lot of things upon returning home. But one of the major things was he directed fire on his mortar team, and he hit a house, and he was going through the house and found the aftermath of there were civilians inside, and he found that. So anyways, sorry to take it off you, but do you want to kind of introduce yourself to the audience?
Well, yeah. So my name is Scott, MD Vet for Peace. Yeah, you already got that. And I was a Marine for 14 years. I was a civil affairs Marine, which I'll explain that when we get around to it. But I did that for 14 years. The last 3 years I was actually a civil affairs instructor. And while I was doing that, I was finally I had always been kind of a conservatarian, but I was finally coming around to being a real libertarian. This is around 2014. Tom Woods' podcast just kind of took off, and it really it put me over the edge. And I got out of the Marine Corps, and I became, and now for a while I just stewed about being anti-war. But when I learned about Bring Our Troops Home and the Defend the Guard Act, it spurred me to action last year. I got onto Twitter and I started trying to be activist, and that's kind of where I am now, is trying to be one more voice speaking out against the war.
That's awesome, man. And I wanted to, so you come from a long history of military vets. Do you want to talk about that a little bit?
Yeah. So, my father was a Marine. Everyone else in my family was in the Army. My father was in the Army in Vietnam. He actually, the running joke is he was a spy because he ended up working for the NSA after that, and had some interesting civilian career. And my grandfathers on both sides were in World War II, and my great grandfather on my father's was a soldier in World War One as well. So as far back as I can trace my family, there, every one of us has been an NCO in the Army, and me being a Marine. So yeah, it was a part of kind of my upbringing, and it's kind of was always it was the water I breathed. I grew up in Annapolis, Maryland, which is where the Naval Academy is. We always had midshipmen staying at our house as guests, and so it was this water I breathed in. It was the only thing that existed to me, and that's kind of was the only thing that I was going to do after high school, and so that's where I ended up, and then sort of long way around to realizing a bunch of things about our government and wars and really understanding libertarianism brought me to kind of the opposite end, where the only thing I want is to tear down the standing army and get us out of all these wars.
And that's quite the transformation, and I remember, because I came from, I mean, not really a similar background to you, but I grew up in Wisconsin, and there's lots of vets around here. It's a very patriotic area, and of course you grow up with the myth of, it's not a myth, but the World War II kind of, we were the greatest, we saved the world kind of thing. And my step grandpa he was a tank commander under Patton, and so he commanded a Sherman crew, and a squad, and I wanted to always talk to him about it, but I never. It always made me really nervous, and I didn't know how he would take it. But he passed away a few years ago, and all that history is gone.
Yeah.
And I wanted to understand what he thought and what he went through and how it affected him. But so my great uncles were also, they you mentioned in your interview with Rollo and Slappy, you at one point were in line to defend nuclear facility.
Yeah. That was what I originally signed up for, was to be a security forces.
Okay, so I'm pretty sure that's what they did. My one great uncle, he repaired airplanes on an aircraft carrier, and they were on shooting teams and stuff. But so my point is, I come from kind of a similar background.
Yeah. And it's interesting you kind of mentioned, in a certain way for me, it was and it wasn't a huge shift. It was kind of more, if you grew up the way I did, which was more of like a conservatarian constitutionalist, there was room in there to question the wars at least a little bit, and to question this giant government. If you thought about it the right way, you could see it, but it was rare for no one really saw it that way. And one of the first real moments for me, on the ground, was kind of this realization that we might be the redcoats. It was around my second time while I was in Iraq. Kind of some of the things we were doing, we were restricting civil liberties. We were just straight up violating the rights of the people of Iraq in ways that I was just sitting there thinking, everything I know, being this revering the founders and framing era, and these people that, to me, the reason they rebelled was, one way to look at the very first at Lexington and Concord is that was, from the British perspective, it was a raid on an arms cache, an illegal cache of weapons. And we did that every day. Every single day we were hunting for caches of weapons. But in the American telling of it, it was this huge violation of everything that came before, and a reason to finally come to blows. But from the British telling, and I was sitting there in Iraq searching around someone's house in the middle of the night for weapons we knew probably weren't there, and thinking, we're the redcoats. And that sort of role reversal and recognition, even someone from a very conservative background, given the right pieces of data, can come to the right conclusions, I think. They just don't really have the information, or maybe it took me years, even from then, to really get there. It was just, well, this war's wrong, until it kind of was well, they all kind of go that way, don't they?
Yeah. Did in your thought process, did you feel the weight of, I don't, cognitive dissonance? Did you feel like you had to accept that what you were doing was right? Because if you didn't accept that, it would break you?
There were times. There were times where, another one, say what you want about Lincoln. He had a beautiful way with words from time to time. And when a friend of mine died in Afghanistan, I really looked to the Gettysburg Address to say that basically to fill this sunk cost fallacy. We have to see it through. It's got to be worth it for everything we've done now, for everything that was lost and wasted. Now we have to, what's the phrasing he uses where he's take greater devotion from that to that cause for which they gave their last full measure of devotion, was a real, a phrase I had to keep repeating myself. Yes, it's screwed up. Yes, it's not working. Yes, the costs are getting way too high, but we actually have to rededicate ourselves to this cause. And that really, that got, when I was really, that was by 2009, I was really not, I had gone through some up and down phases, and that was one of the ones where I kind of got myself back on the upswing, because it's like, I was, my second deployment in 2006-07 was pretty bad in certain ways, just obviously counterproductive and stupid. And I was getting ready to go again in 2009, and that was one of those things I kept coming back to, is like, well, we have to just rededicate ourselves and finish the job right, kind of stuff. We screwed it up, but we're going to fix it, and then we'll go. And so that kind of kept me hanging on for a few more years, unfortunately, in a certain sense.
Well, did you see your fellow soldiers kind of struggling with the same thing? Was it talked about a lot?
Oh yeah, I mean, yes, maybe not in so many direct terms, but there's the smoke, when you're sitting around the smoke pit, where you sit around and you BS, and there's always going to be somebody that just has has had a bad day or a pessimistic perspective, and so there would be moments where people kind of like, what the fuck what are we doing here, kind of stuff. But even then, it's always there. We're so bathed in irony that it can kind of just be washed over. Like, yeah, I kicked in 5 Iraqis' houses today and found nothing, and wear the red coats, ha 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 ha, yeah. and then just kind of move on, forget about it, pack that up, put it away. You're not going anywhere. You still got to do this job. So it existed, but people ultimately just grind their way through that. And then later on they find it, once the hard parts are over, they put it away, whatever it is. But so it exists, but if God only knows what they would start to do with you if you really started actively you're there, kind of. And then you have the opportunity to get out at some point. There's so many people that the overwhelming majority, especially of your infantry types and Marines and Army in particular, only do 4 years and they're done. After that, well, you just put that behind you.
I have a new client actually who served in Vietnam, and I didn't get a chance to ask him if, because we're dealing with the VA and everything in terms of with his injury case, but it was interesting kind of talking to him about it and not knowing, what I should say or what exactly I should say, because not knowing if he was drafted or what his experience was. But he mentioned something about Agent Orange, and you just as a civilian, not ever being in that position, you don't really know how to approach a vet to talk about something like that.
Yeah,
well, you should.
No one. It's really a conundrum, and I don't know that I've solved the puzzle. I heard somebody say something interesting, and they were kind of more coming from the patriotic bent, but they talked about just the alternate ways, especially around veteran and Armistice Day. Still have to correct myself sometimes. People want to know. They know that a lot of people, and I always chafed at "thank you for your service." I finally kind of came around to saying, well, something like, well, you paid for it, and believe it or not, everyone tries to self-rationalize and justify what they did and what their job was. But an interesting way that somebody proposed to start the conversation is just to say, I see you were in the service or something like that. I don't even love the word service anymore, but that's another thing. I see you were in the military, what'd you do? You know what I mean? And let them kind of open it and lead into the conversation with kind of what did you do that you're willing to share? and then that it can give you a feel for where to go and give them an opportunity to, express whatever that is, because it is hard. We don't always make it easy, because you'll get the person. I've been the person who's given the kind of inscrutable answer. You know what I mean?
Yeah.
I don't have time to talk about it, or I don't want to talk about it with you, and so it makes it unjustifiably hard on people that haven't lived that life to understand it, and it doesn't do anyone any good to be that way necessarily. But that was an interesting, at least, take on how to approach it. Just be, what did you do?
Yeah.
And then let them try to explain it if they want to.
Well, and I think you would, before we went on, you had mentioned that you'd listened to my show for quite some time. And I think when I was first trying to educate myself on foreign policy, I think I took it too far in the other direction, being critical of soldiers and what their role is and everything. And I just kind of came to the conclusion that what I really want to do is be part of the solution, talk to people about things, see what they went through, in it's a terrible thing, but it's a crazy experience,
And there's definitely, it's challenging even for me to talk to my friends who aren't in the same place, like my closest friends that were in the Marine Corps with me. It's not easy to exactly. People more than most other jobs, especially with the Marine Corps, but even other services, it's what they sell is a new identity for people that want a new identity, and people don't very readily give up an identity. It really is one of those things. If you start to question them or what they've done, you're really putting them on the back foot in a way that people don't necessarily respond to very well. And like I said before, people will rationalize just about anything they've done. So it is a real challenge, that people are right to be skeptical of people that were in the military, because you can meet someone who has never questioned a single day of what they did, or even terrible things they've done. They've never really given it much thought. And that can put you in this position where you're like, how can you be okay with what you did? And those kind of, and I don't know, I don't know that everyone kind of is, like, I was this neocon-ish conservatarian person with some huge blind spots for most of my life. I got there eventually. I don't know if I would have gotten there faster if somebody knocked me over the head with libertarianism, or if I had to be like, just hear the right message at the right moment. You know what I mean? And that goes for everyone else that you might want to talk to. You might be able to bring them around, or they might just dig their heels in harder. But I don't think, I don't know that, like, let's say calling them all baby killers.
Right.
The thing, I don't know if you know this, but like, part of the indoctrination, is singing chants about killing babies.
Right.
You know what I mean? It's not. It's a lot of that's been cleaned up from the Marine Corps, but at least this was 2003, so grain of salt. But like when I was in SOI, when they got us away from the barracks and the flagpole and the officers, we were singing chants about napalm sticking to kids. You know what I mean?
Yep.
And all kinds of stuff like that. So on the one hand, like, if you call them all baby, like they adapted. I would venture to say they adapted their indoctrination to compensate for being called baby killers. That it's an adaptive organization, and they actually, the whole part of the process is trying to inure people to violence and inure people to criticism in a certain sense. So when the Vietnam era started calling veterans baby killers, the military responded by, yeah, we're fucking baby killers, and we'll just make that part of the indoctrination, and now you'll call us that and we'll laugh in your face.
Yeah. I certainly see how that would work.
Yeah.
Kind
of embracing it, even if ironically, Not actually. I don't think anytime I sang that song, I really thought that I'd be shooting a flamethrower at a baby, but somehow they. So what else would be the purpose for that? I remember at the time thinking it was a little bit grotesque, but when you're with 40 other guys and all the jokes are about stuff like that, then you just kind of go along and listen to it. So, yeah, engaging with veterans as a libertarian or any anti-war person is tricky. You know what I mean? And I wish I could give you a really good answer, but you can kind of gauge, I think, if you get them talking, because everyone they'll love to tell you some story. You know what I mean? Of some event. And also another thing, for what it's worth, everyone who's been in the military has seen some kind of absurdly backwards or wasteful decision making that at the time they probably thought of as a joke, but at least as an opening towards sort of libertarianism. Like, I mean, if you talk to, let's say, 5 out of my friends that were all on Fallujah my first time I was overseas, at one point we got a box full of humanitarian relief supplies. This was just after the Battle of Fallujah. So, like, the city, like, we're in this destroyed amusement park that was blown to pieces, houses burning around us, and this big crate full of thigh masters gets dropped off. I mean, 5,000 thigh masters that we're supposed to distribute to the people of Iraq as humanitarian relief. And it's comical, but that's the kind of stuff, like, that happens all the time. I mean, there's a certain element of the military that is more MASH or more Pentagon Wars than it is Band of Brothers. You know what I mean? There's always going to be that moment where somebody saw something so absurdly stupid or backwards that they might tell you, like, they're telling you a funny story. It's going to be something where either their commanding officer or the supply chain really screwed them over. That gotta be one of those inroads to be like, yeah, that's government for you. You know what I mean?
Right. Yeah. No, well, and that's why I'm so grateful to talk to you, because it's I know that we're of like mind, and it feels safe to ask these questions. So it's really great for me to. But have you seen Generation Kill?
Oh yeah, I love it.
Yeah, that was the first thing that I thought of. Where friendly fire takes out one of the supply trucks that's carrying the regiment's colors, and they just leave it, and that's a great one for that kind of stuff. But also I've never seen a show be able to capture what I have to imagine the camaraderie is like between soldiers, at least in this age.
Yeah, that's a really good one. I actually just I rewatched some of that very recently, and it was a lot like the experience of my second deployment, where we spent a lot of time in the truck, so it would just be 3 or 4 of us spending endless hours kind of just BSing with each other and singing the stupid songs until everyone in the truck is sick of them. All of that is real. It's so real, for us, it was Jimmy Buffett songs for a while for no real reason. Just they were easy.
Yeah, you were mentioning kind of the camaraderie just a little bit earlier, and the only thing that I could think of that would be comparable in my life would be when you get together with all the guys to go deer hunting, and you screw around and you say, you could be joking about being a deer slayer and all the kind of black humor that goes into it.
Mm-hmm.
Are you a hunter at all?
Not really. I have, but I wouldn't venture to call myself that. I just gone with friends a time or two. But yeah, just the other day, a friend of mine was talking about messing with his friend by nicking the intestine while they were, like, his friend was being super dainty and careful, field stripping the deer, and then he was like, and just to ruin his day. I don't know why.
well, I mean, I can see And it's not a close parallel because it's not even anything similar, but there's a vein of death and killing in it, I
Yeah.
guess. That's like, well, when you want to be respectful to the deer, but when you're cutting out the deer's asshole, like it's hard not to make a joke or something.
Well, so when I was, so one of the jobs we got stuck with, we stuck ourselves with, um, was in Fallujah in 2006. There were mostly insurgent KIA, but also some civilians, and it was a few hundred, if not thousand, people that were killed, and we took on the task of removing them. Like there was a group of mortuary affairs Marines who were trained to deal with Marines who had been killed to be packaged up and sent home. But they also had been tasked with it. But they were doing a pretty grisly job. They were literally driving by in like a truck and throwing meat hooks out and trying to fish the bodies up off the street, which obviously, if you know anything about Islam, it's similar to the traditional burial. Doesn't matter who has been killed, or what they've done wrong. They should be buried before sundown the next day. I think it has to be head towards Mecca. Like there's a religious tradition of dealing respectfully with the dead that this was abhorrent to. And so we, as the Civil Affairs Marines, found an imam and his what's the word I'm blanking right now? Congregation. And they voluntarily, they did this for no cost and no charge. We searched them every morning. We loaded them into trucks. We drove around the city looking for bodies. We searched the bodies and removed the weapons from them. And then they bagged them up and took them off to a burial ground to deal with it a little bit more respectfully. But even in that process, you're walking around, digging around in dead bodies to remove grenades and ammunition and stuff like that. And we got to a point of, it was pretty foul work. And so we started nicknaming things. Like when you rolled over one body and half the face was eaten by maggots and the other half was perfectly intact. Like I walked up and I was like, is this guy alive? Is he just like, do we need to get a doctor? Like, and then I rolled him over. The other half was gone. And so he's Two-Face. And the guy that fell down the well and was floating there, his name was Bob. Kind of the gallows humor takes hold at some point. It's definitely a part of any. I think probably I imagine some morticians have some pretty jokes that would horrify just about anybody else, because when you're dealing with that, you definitely come up with humor used as a coping mechanism, to be sure.
Yeah, for sure. It's not the same as that, of course, but in my line of business, personal injury work, we have several cases that are pretty grim and pretty grisly. And the same thing with that, I totally understand it's not out of disrespect, but you gotta to try and, I don't know, put away the heaviness of it. Like for instance, we have cases, gas propane explosion cases where an entire house with a family inside exploded, and down to the foundation.
Yeah.
Or we have some where a stove exploded and sended our client across the room and through a wall. Like one of the attorneys, we have an expert, he nicknamed him Dr. Boom. He's a great expert, but you got to deal with the grisliness of it somehow, and it's not out of disrespect. Like I totally understand that.
Yeah. What's interesting, what is worth dealing with is, to a certain extent, for a long time, that allows you to sort of, not intentionally, but dehumanize yourself and separate yourself from it. So, like, one of those things is, I mean, not every Marine was exposed to all these things, but for a long time, part of my job, aside from that, a more normal thing we did, and you might find this interesting, is deal with compensating people for battle damages. That was like that was our bread and butter day job mostly, was literally adjudicating whether somebody's smashing in somebody's window merited that, whether their door was kicked in, their window was broken, $15, will that be good? And I would sit there and negotiate with them over, and we but this also included people who were horrifically injured sometimes. Include like a ricocheted bullet hit them in the jaw and blew their jaw half off. And we're sitting there, well, how much does it cost you to go to the hospital? Like trying to negotiate with this guy with half a jaw. So for a long time, I didn't really humanize those people very much. And really think about how even the more minor inconveniences, like, police don't as often shoot out people's tires here or burn or, do any number of things either accidentally or intentionally that are like, they do a lot, you know what I mean?
Yeah.
Of horrifying things that we wouldn't accept. But through either carelessness or sometimes felt necessity, like we do a lot of damage to civilians there. And just the inconvenience and daily indignity of like having some Marine, maybe you get compensated for it, maybe you don't, but some Marine kicks in your door or breaks your windshield in to search your car. Or there was a case where, we were searching a truck with sheep in the back of it. One of the sheep, this guy's a shepherd taking his sheep into the city for slaughter and sale. And one of them escapes and then gets caught in the barbed wire. And then some wild dogs run along and attack his sheep. And the whole time Marines are laughing at this somewhat comical comedy of errors. And then at the end of the day, I go to my boss and I say, we kind of should pay this guy because we're sort of responsible for him losing his sheep. And he's like, well, we didn't lose the sheep. We didn't make the sheep run away. We didn't make the dogs eat it. And I'm like, but if we hadn't been here searching the place, searching his truck in the first place, this never would have happened. And like, as a person not even able to really advocate for themselves in the situation very well, I never humored the person very much. So it was kind of my job to be that voice of reason and advocate for people in certain situations, but it also makes you a bit of a pariah or a joke to the other Marines. They're like, why do you care? Yeah. And you're threading this needle of like not being the bleeding heart that they despise because you're always an annoyance. You have to find ways to provide things they value also, or persuade them that like, yeah, if I give this guy money, he might be willing to talk to us in the future or help us in the future. Just being decent and compensating them for damages wasn't really enough of a reason, I mean, it was in certain cases, but sometimes you had to make the case. And it was like, because we had access to tons of money. I was walking around with a backpack with $50,000 that I could, no kidding.
Yeah, that's crazy.
And I could re-up that every month. I could spend $50,000 a month and nobody would question it. Really. So it just kind of depended how much damage we were doing. And no one was really ever blamed or found at fault for being wantonly destructive is the other thing. Like we created a real moral hazard to a certain extent that the Marines knew they could. I was just watching, you were looking for this. I was looking for another documentary to send you. And the Marines have this way, I'm sure the Army does too. Their combat camera guys like film things. And then every unit at the end of their deployment, they'll put together a video of all the coolest little clips they've gotten of them kicking in a door, shooting a lock, or that's what they do. They make these little exciting, actiony videos of everything that happened for them to watch when they all get home together. And there must be a million of these because I know I've seen one from another unit where the guy just kind of smashed a mirror because it would look cool. Like he jammed his muzzle into the mirror just to watch it shatter. And it was a giant, 6x6 mirror, probably wasn't the cheapest thing on earth. But then the video I just caught today was them just like smashing every window in a car for fun. You know, watch this. Psh, I can smash the window. And it's like, to a certain extent, I know, because especially in my second deployment, the Marines kind of got the idea that we were just the money bags, that they felt like they could steal or loot. I literally had to tell them no once when we occupied this guy's house, and he was apparently a shopkeeper, and he had a whole inventory of candies and stuff like that up in his sort of attic area. And while they were searching, they were just stuffing their pockets full of everything they could, like just candies and snacks and cigarettes, you know. And I had to be like, dude, this is stealing. And they were like, what? You can pay them, right? It's battle damages.
Right.
And I'm like, no, this isn't battle damage. It's like, well, what if because we shot the locks off, it got stolen? And it's like, I could pay for that, but you shouldn't do it. It doesn't make it right. And literally, whether you're at like that low level of some lance corporal who thinks that like the civil affairs guys will pay for it, so it doesn't matter if I break it or steal it, to up at the top level where generals kind of don't have to worry about reminding their Marines to be at least thoughtful and not wantonly destructive. This kind of just reminds me of the very beginning of Combat Obscura too, where the very first scene in that is really it's funny. It's, you know, they're sitting there waiting to watch a bomb drop, and everyone gets their cameras out, you know, and then it hits the wrong house. And so the first thing they say is, oh shit, that's the wrong house. And they're like, oh shit. And they start cheering. And it's like, that's a person's house.
Yeah.
That's for all you know, there's people living in there. You know what I mean? You just might have blown a whole family of civilians to pieces, but you know, big boom, you know, and there's just no telling. There's really like, you could approximate based off of like the SERP expenditures, and I know the Intercept kind of did this at one point. SERP is the emergency response program that this money comes from. That we pay for damages with. You can get an idea of how much the battle damages were, but that's just the ones that we actually witnessed, were there for, could verify in some way. God knows how many more have been done that just were never addressed. Because a lot of times the Marines, civil affairs Marines, weren't everywhere. And so a lot of times a Marine who maybe he felt bad about it in some cases, or a soldier, maybe they wanted to make amends for running over someone's sheep or knocking over the wall with their truck, or a little car fender bender they had where they ran a motorcycle off the road. These are all examples of things I paid for that are just popping into my head, you know? Maybe they might have felt guilty for it, but they just kept on driving. I've seen that happen where they just were like, what are we supposed to do? We're not stopping a whole convoy because that guy's in a car accident. So maybe they just kept going, or other incidents where they didn't even know that there was a process in place to deal with those things. And so they were like, I don't know what to do. Sorry, bye. You know, and I guarantee you that happened at least, well, whatever we paid in battle damages, which is in the hundreds of millions, I think. I bet you there's at least twice as many things that happened that were never addressed. You know what I mean? Which is crazy. And so at the top tiers, I mean, that money was flowing. There was so much money flowing into the country that I don't even think if there was anyone concerned about how much we were spending in battle damage, I never heard of it. At least up to the colonel level, probably the general level, like within our civil affairs command, nobody was like, oh, we should really tell them to be more careful. Never in a million years did that occur to anyone. At least up to the level of like colonels in our unit that would be speaking to the generals. Like, there was never anyone saying, you know, we're being a little bit destructive here, you know? So all that money sort of enabled too, you know? But getting Marines to deal with it or getting people who did those things to kind of, you know, sorry, I'll stop my long soliloquy here for a second, but it's almost just like you take people out of their settings and they kind of be like, when a child breaks something, their first instinct when you cause, or even like when you back up and you hit somebody's car and you know you should leave a note, but the first thing you do is kind of look around and think, this is gonna, I don't want to deal with this. Let's just pretend it didn't happen and move on. Little kids do it, and we're all kind of prone to that behavior, but like you should expect better. And people kind of, when people have done those things, let's just say if there ever was a fender bender that I drove away from and I left a little scratch on their car or whatever, you eventually just forget about it. You kind of put it behind you. Very few people are just going to carry that guilt around. Like, you've put it behind you. There's nothing I could do about it anyways at this point. Too bad, so sad. I'm sorry. I feel guilt. Maybe you feel guilty about it for a little while, but eventually you forget it ever happened. And it must be, at one point, a couple million people have been to Iraq and Afghanistan. Now I think it's like 1.2 million or something deployments overall, and I guarantee you most people had some incident like that and just packed it up and forgot about it, and making somebody face that is a tough sell.
Yeah, I'm sure it is. The thing that strikes me is that any number of those things, like the resilience of these people must be incredible, because any number of those things, if it happened to someone here, it would maybe ruin your month or year or life.
Yeah.
I mean, go by degree here, like a fender bender. Okay, that would probably ruin your week or your month.
Yeah.
And that's the most benign thing that happened.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and it's crazy because they especially in Afghanistan, they live such a margin. I mean, I don't know what not everyone has seen it, but I mean, these are literally people. They have some modern conveniences, and they have, modern fertilizer and stuff like that. But these are people that they still live in a hand-built mud hut that they use ditches that they've dug themselves to bring water from the river to their fields. They flood their fields and then drain it off. And it's borderline prehistoric agriculture, with the exception of like they get a tractor to come around and plow the field for them, but they have to pay for that. But other than that, they hand harvest. They have, it's this weird hodgepodge of like 1930s, 1940s, like looking tractors that they use to like mill flour and some advanced technologies, combined with them hand winnowing. If you ever, like, they winnow, literally, you watch them winnow their wheat by hand. They'll put a blanket out, they'll wait for a breezy day, and they'll throw it up in the air and watch all the chaff blow away. That must be the way it was done 5,000 years ago, and they're still doing it that way. So these are people that are living an incredibly like subsistence existence, and then like, weirdly, it's probably the modern conveniences that are most likely to be destroyed. Like, we'll drive through a wheat field or land a helicopter in one, and that'll destroy their crop for the year. But it's also just as like where it's going to be the cars on the road that we shoot up or blow up. So like, and not everyone has those. They share, that's like 5 different families, or kind of one family, all cousins, one massively extended family, all sharing that car. It's crazy that they live such a subsistence, and these are, so we're like, it's really strange that I think Sebastian Junger put it really interesting, where it's like, a Marine will fire $100,000 missile. A Marine who gets paid, who won't make $100,000 in 10 years, will fire a $100,000 missile at a farmer who won't make $100,000 in their whole life. You know what I mean?
Yeah.
Like, it really is crazy, the array of technology we use against these people who still, like, most of them just keep their heads down and try to exist. Like, they've survived. They're survivors, if nothing else. I was talking to somebody recently about somebody was saying, I was in this discussion about whether the people of Afghanistan support the current regime. And the one thing we experienced, there was this program that we paid God knows what to some consulting firm to create. It's called TCAF. tactical conflict assessment and planning framework. And the idea was like to ask this standardized set of 4 questions to everyone you met. Is stability, what's the greatest problem in your area? Is stability increasing or decreasing in your area? What's the greatest cause of instability? And one more. And survey as many. So like you'll probably find some Marines that have like PTSD from TCAF, because for a while it was like this big push. It was part of counterinsurgency. You had to have this metric. Is it getting more secure or less secure? And what's the biggest cause of instability? And so you were supposed to massively collect this data and feed it up the chain. And the thing that was endlessly frustrating about it is, you know, when Afghans have learned very astutely to say whatever will please the person with the gun in front of them. You know what I mean? They've lived for 50 years in a war zone, and then when the Taliban's around, they'll say, "Yeah, we love you guys." And then when there's a Afghan soldier around, "Yeah, the Afghan soldier is real good." You know what I mean? And you could tell they're sort of guarded about it. They're very guarded. They never show outward support if they can avoid it, and they're very much willing to play both sides, bribe both sides, do whatever they can to please both sides. And actually, that reminds me, I sent one of the last things I sent you was a documentary called The Ritchie Boys, and that was about. And what's funny is Marines get really upset because they feel like they're being lied to. And Americans have this very strong conception of like, well, you can't lie to us, right? And there was this documentary called The Ritchie Boys. It was about French and German interpreters, many of whom were Jewish, who joined the army during World War II, and then they served as interpreters. And one of them told this story about he since became a professor at Princeton, I think, of French. He told this story about Normandy on D-Day, doing an interview with a civilian, trying to find out where the Germans were. And this Frenchman, you know, we're at a fork in the road. Are the Germans should we go to the right or to the left? And this Frenchman said, "Go right." And they drove straight into an ambush or something like that. And it occurred, and you could tell this guy was like fucking collaborator or something like that. He was pissed that he was still pissed 50 years later that this guy lied to them. And I was sitting there, and I know I had 100 interactions like that where some Marines angry that an Iraqi or Afghan lied to them. And me, with my little lens on at this point, and I wrote to this guy to ask him if this was even possible. He's like, was that Frenchman's house to the left, and he didn't want the fighting to happen by his house? Because that's the kind of thing you get when people are living through a combat zone, is they'll think, well, just go that way. I live that way. I don't want you going that way. You know what I mean? Is it possible he was lying to save his own skin, or because there was something of greater interest to him? Like, it didn't exactly, like, just coming to this immediate conclusion this person was a collaborator and, you know, deserved a bullet to the back of the head from the new regime doesn't necessarily seem warranted. You know what I mean? At least, so that's by the time I was getting to where I am now. That was around 2011, 12. I emailed this guy, and he wrote back. Yeah, he was thoughtful. He was a French professor at Princeton at this point in his life, and he was like, you know, I hadn't really thought about that, but that's possible. And I was like, because that's one of the lessons I taught also while I was a civil affairs instructor, was working with interpreters, knowing how to get an interpreter to ask the question you want and get the information you need in response. It's a little bit of an art, especially when you have to worry about the interpreter, who's a local, and the person who's also a local, having their own angles they're working. There were all kinds of crazy incidents where interpreters would, with us dealing with money, they would try to grift and like get a take by playing up the damage sometimes. Or if there was a project we were doing to repair something, they would be like, well, you know, they would tell the contractor that we were going to hire, like, ask for 15,000, I can get you 15,000, just give me 2,000. You know what I mean? And sort of working against us, or in any case, all that's to say, like, it's really, really difficult to consider how that Afghans in particular are survivors. And, you know, you see some statistic that says 60% of them support the current regime. I could get 60% of Afghans to probably say yes to anything I ask them, as long as it means I'll go away. Because the longer I'm standing there, the more likely they are to get shot at too. You know?
It's the whole Misesian thing that incentives matter. It seems like, and I mean to that end, like, so you were talking about the mortuary team earlier, and all while that was happening, I bet you a block over, some guy is, tending to his sheep or getting ready to take things to market. Life goes on.
Uh-huh.
Because I mean, from a civilian point of view, we assume that, a battlefield is like, oh well, everything's deserted and people are gone and every life is on hold, like you see in World War I movies or something. Yeah.
Yeah, speaking of life going on here in Baltimore, there's a police helicopter overhead. So sorry, I muted for a second, but I hope you didn't get.
It's all good.
No, it really, like, they tried to implement that concept and teach Marines. They used to say it was a 3-block war. That in one block you could be in active combat, in one block you could be like, then the next block over, it could be perfectly normal and life as usual. That's what they called it. They called it the 3-block war for exactly that reason. And then the next block over, there could be rebuilding going on or something like that. And so they tried to introduce Marines to that idea, but it doesn't. Well, even then. So I've shared this story a lot of times, but I'll try to keep it quick. But it never dawned. I had one incident. This was my first and really kind of only time where I was in a firefight, full blown, everything going on, tanks shooting, the whole 9 yards. And we were on top of a highway. And it's weird. It's Iraq. So this is a 6-lane highway on a raised embankment. Because there was some pretty robust Saddam era infrastructure, and we're in this fight, and one of the things, this actually reminds me of something else funny that I always joke about, but it took us a year and a half to realize that, like, all of our trucks are brown. And camouflage isn't exactly the most helpful in certain situations. So when a car is barreling down the highway at you, and you're brown on brown, sand colored in camouflage, they very well might not be a suicide vehicle-borne IED that's trying to kill you. They very well might just not even know you're there. And then when you shoot that car full of people, it kind of becomes an issue, or it ought to. And it took people a real long time to figure out how can we, and they never really it just doesn't jive. Being camouflaged and being in an urban environment doesn't work for the people who have to live there and know, like, when the Marine hiding behind the corner is about to kill them, and have to know when the Marine hiding behind the corner is no threat at all. It's crazy. I always joked, this is a bit of an aside, but Marines, and especially, there's this thing, they'll always get you have to run a lot, and people are always exercising on Marine Corps base. And the exercise uniform, some bases will have a policy they'll call, and they'll say you have to wear green on green, your undershirt, your issued undershirt and shorts. Well, that doesn't make for so great a situation if people are running at dawn and dusk in a woodland environment. You had Marines getting hit by cars and trucks while they're running on the side of the road wearing their green on green uniform. So the Marine Corps solution wasn't to just let people wear whatever they wanted. It was to require a reflective belt be worn. So it's very important that you be in your green uniform, but we can, as an adjunct to that uniform, we can add a bright yellow reflective belt. Rather than just wearing normal running gear. And then they went one further and they designed this tracksuit with, like, reflective patterning in it. But it was still olive drab. It was still green. Like, their Marine Corps colors are red and blue. You could make it a bright You can make it stoplight red tracksuit and with gold reflective striping, and those would be in keeping with the Marine Corps flag. And you wouldn't have this problem with Marines getting run over, but instead you make it a green tracksuit to solve the problem of Marines being too green. And it just doesn't even dawn on people like that you have to interact with the civilian environment. Even if they're cognitively aware of it, they don't actually think through the implications. That's oddly enough what my job was. What civil affairs is supposed to be is kind of be the one person in the room thinking about both levels. You know what I mean? For a while, that's why they only had civil affairs in the reserves, is they felt like we would be more familiar with civilian life and therefore able to translate better between the two. But yeah, that just it's a weird bridge. The chasm, the civilian military divide is unfortunately too large a chasm. You know what I mean? And it's a hard one to bridge too. You know, it's really, but the only way you can do it is by talking. Ultimately,
Yeah.
You know. So that's kind of the beauty of getting on the line with you.
Oh, of course. Yeah. No,
Yeah.
you're a wonderful guest. Holy crap. There's so much here. I mean, one thing is I thought about, so the weapons that the insurgents had, are we talking like Turkish Mausers or just like, is it true? So sorry, is an AK at one point in time on the black market, was it worth like a pack of cigarettes?
Gosh, I couldn't tell you. You know, in Fallujah, you would not believe the variety and scale of weapons that were stockpiled there. So I would venture to say they were pretty cheap. Like we literally, I remember at one point, they decided to allow us to start arming our interpreters. And our interpreter, one of our interpreters, the one we had, like, we still have a relationship with. He actually moved to the States for a while. He had been supposedly Republican Guard, but this is many years ago, and he had this little, you know. But there was literally, I mean, probably a 10-foot tall pile of any gun you could imagine on our fob, on our base, that had all been confiscated. And when we were allowed to let him choose a weapon, we were just, here you go. And he was like a kid in a candy store. We were just digging through a pile, mostly AKs, but if you could name a gun, there was probably at least one of them there. And he pulled out an MP5, and we loved it, and we played around with it, and that's what he was carrying around while we were there.
That's so cool.
But we were all sitting there like, oh, can we take one too? And
yeah, right.
there were so many, and I could send you. You know, my job wasn't clearing arms caches or anything like that, so none of these are my personal photos. They're just like collected from friends. But you wouldn't believe everything: rockets, RPGs, you name it. Stuff that I'm sure they didn't even know. Like, I remember for a while we were puzzling over some little. It turned out we figured out what it was. It was like a giant shotgun shell, and I remember we were just looking around like, what the hell is that? And it was what they would call a cartridge starter for an engine. Like certain old engines, or even some jet engines, you basically you can rapid start them by basically firing a giant shotgun shell into them, like a giant shotgun blank, to start an engine very quickly. And yeah, so there was the weirdest stuff. I mean, anything that could go boom, they would gather up and hide somewhere, because you never know when it might come in handy, I guess.
Right.
So, yeah, I certainly would say, yeah, that's a regular household item, you know.
Yeah.
Right. So.
Yeah, and I mean, is there a culture there? Like, I guess we would call it a 2A culture, but is there a culture of bearing arms?
Afghanistan, certainly. Iraq, less so. I mean, some of that is more urban population. You know, this was another one where this kind of was one of those sort of red coat moments where we had to I remember the sort of negotiation over the policy. Not that I was a part of it, but that, can an Iraqi keep a firearm? And are we really And there was discussion, at least even among Marines, like, are we really fighting for their freedom if we're going to take all their guns away? Because there's at the very least an arms culture among people in the military, and there's plenty of people that support the right to bear arms. So then, like, stripping people of that felt very. But then they settled on a policy, and this should tell you where, ultimately the policymakers stand and why you really can't trust your government to protect it. They saw the problem that we're not respecting the right to bear arms, so they just settled $1,000 per household. And watch that, and that's I've one of the light bulb moments for me to really becoming fully anarchist, in at least philosophically. I'm happy to move there pragmatically. I'd rather not lurch there. But one of the things was realizing that, and also turning against, like, we need to get rid of this military, is that the standing army is the test bed for every policy that eventually gets implemented on us. Like, alcohol prohibition was pilot tested in World War I as a wartime measure. Drug prohibition, the same. Income tax. Government-built housing was a World War II measure. Government involvement in health insurance was a wartime measure. All of these, just, if you go to the root of almost any policy, any of the bad policies of the last century, and you can probably find that it was at least pilot tested as a wartime measure in the military first, because we don't have the same rights. And also pilot test people that we, as a way of ruling over them. So those are the kinds of things where it's like the military they saw the conundrum of disarming the populace. They wanted to disarm the populace, but they also saw a bit of a problem with it. But they settled on, well, we could take away most of your rights. You know what I mean?
So in his one household, like 15 people?
In some cases, yeah.
Yeah.
But yeah, that was one of those little absurdities that just, and there's a million other things I'm not thinking of it. You'll prompt me and I'll think of another one, but there are a million other things where we just, people, well, another one is they have no right not to be searched there. That one we blew right out of the water. The right to be secure in your person did not exist in Iraq or Afghanistan. If we felt like we wanted to search your car, your home, or your person, no rights apply. The Constitution does not apply. And I really wanted I never really got to do this. For a little period of time, they would bring me and the civil affairs captain. I mostly was just the lackey. They threw me a bone and let me teach one class, but I mostly was there to set up the projector and make sure everything was in line. But while I was at the civil affairs school, they would send me to what they would call the Coin Academy, which would be like 1 week of lessons for mostly the officer class of an infantry battalion before they went to Iraq. So I went to be an instructor, but I got to teach like one little class to the enlisted only at the Coin Academy. And I used a lesson about a Marine in Haiti who was just a little bit more creative, and he took the time to learn Creole, and he really integrated himself into the population as sort of my inroad, because it wasn't my place to teach. I wasn't teaching civil affairs. I was just teaching like how to engage with the civil population or something like that was the name of my class. But I really wanted, and I didn't finish the job, but I really wanted to make a case study written from the perspective, I'm going to blank on the guy's name right now, but written from the perspective of the Marine major who was at the lead of the Lexington and Concord it was mostly British Army regulars, but there was a small platoon of Marines also, and they led the column. So I wanted to write it from the entire perspective of this British Marine officer leading his platoon to search an arms cache. and sort of write in all the things where there had been like another incident earlier where they had tried to search an armed cache and the militia had stopped them. These were called the powder alarms. And every step along the way kind of, I don't know how many Marines would have immediately picked up on it, but I wanted to camouflage it as being Marines in Iraq for the entire story. You step off on patrol, you get dropped off in the middle of a marsh, and you have to stop, and you have to, all these other, like all the historical details would be there, but then just kind of pull the curtain back and be like, ha ha ha, those are the British. We're the redcoats here.
That's brilliant. Yeah.
I really wanted to do that, and part of it would be like, oh, you stopped and searched this this messenger, and you held him, you detained him for a few hours in a house and interrogated him, and like, and they were like, yeah, of course you should do that. You should, Williams Dawes guy, he seems suspect, and you know, he seems like he's like, there's all these messages going around, and people are ringing bells everywhere. These are indicators. There's a real threat here, and have them have them like violate every constitutional. See how far to violating every constitutional right of an American that we value now that they would go before they're like, no, we can't disarm the entire populace, and see if you could really push them up to that, and then see it like just step by step, have them violate one civil liberty after another until they realized that they were the redcoats themselves. That's what I never got to do it, but that was like my dream, was to try to do that to a group of Marines.
That'd be a wonderful psychological experiment.
Yeah.
I'm sure, like the Milgram experiment, kind of.
Yeah, kind of. You know, just set it up. And I really thought that you could do it just by telling the story of Lexington and Concord, but just rewriting it in modern language and change the setting to Iraq or Afghanistan.
Yeah,
you know,
that's brilliant. That's like worth a documentary or going through with the film crew or something. That'd be really.
I would need a group of Marines that like weren't. Yeah, if I could have, I never got to. I never really finished it. It was like a side project of mine, and then I was kind of just ready to be out of the Marine Corps, and the coin academies dried up also. I probably would have slammed it all together for at least one final hurrah if they hadn't stopped sending me to those, and so I never really got the chance. But
did you read We Meant Well?
No, I don't believe I have.
Okay, are you familiar with that?
Give me a quick synopsis, and I'll see if I'm. Sorry, maybe it's a.
Oh, no worries. I didn't mean to put you on the spot. It's by Peter Van Buren, and I think that Kyle Ancelone has had him on his show.
Yeah. I heard the title before, and I'm very guilty of being a person who listens to a couple of interviews about a book and believing I read the book.
Yeah, right. No, I have it, and I think I read the first few chapters, so I'll fess up right now. But he was a civil affairs officer, and I think he was a civilian.
Kidding.
What's that?
I said, no kidding. I need to talk to him.
Yeah, and he's very good. Like, he's a civilian, but I think he worked with the State Department. And let's see, basically going through and trying to rebuild Iraq. Mm-hmm. And so, I mean, there's stories upon stories of what exactly you were talking about, like a truckload of books showing up in the middle of this war-torn country. They're all in English or something. Like, it's all no, it's American literature classics transcribed to yeah.
Oh yeah. And a lot of it was well-meaning people who, and a lot of it, honestly, and this, you know, where the Thigh Masters came from, and where you also, I'm sure you've heard of this phenomena of like the losing Super Bowls T-shirts all materialize in because they print 2 sets of T-shirts, so millions and millions of whatever the losing team was, and then they just dump them for free on charity, and it's a tax write-off, and it all works. It's a perfectly fine thing to do, but that's part of how you end up with like all of these supplies staged that are just kind of silly sometimes. Yeah, when it comes to all the projects we were doing, there was definitely, I'm sure that book covers it, and I'm sure it's we did things like build schools. We built a soccer field, and we rebuilt that amusement park I mentioned. It was called Jolan Park. We paid to have those things rebuilt, and the soccer field, I remember I heard this because it was my team leader's like pet project that he got off the ground, and he wanted to have it finished before we left, and it wasn't quite finished by the time we left. And you kind of convince yourself that if you were there, it wouldn't have happened this way. But when our replacements did the ribbon cutting on it, immediately after the ribbon was cut, the population descended on the fresh turf of the soccer field, cut it all up, and carted it off onto their front lawns.
Yeah.
And it was thousands and thousands of dollars to have
God.
soccer field, to reopen the city and, give to the people of, turn this empty field into a happy place. And then people are like, that's stupid. We'll take the lawn now. Schools that were built that we never hired, there were no teachers for, and turned into stables. All kinds of, you wouldn't believe, the various different projects that seemed like a great idea, but if the government of that country is not capable. We had to teach Marines eventually, because I taught this job, and you had to teach them. That was one of the lessons. Is like, the way I would always put it to them is like, okay, you're going to ask an Iraqi what they want. I'm going to ask you, what's your dream car? You know what I mean? I have if Donald Trump is the person that comes to mind, but if somebody with untold millions of dollars walks up to you and asks you, what's your dream car? I'll buy it for you right now. You're going to say Ferrari, or, you know what I mean? And then if I leave you a Ferrari, the car insurance and the gas is going to bankrupt you in a week.
Right. Yeah.
If you try to keep it up. You can't give you a Ferrari. It would be a bad idea for me to gift you a Ferrari, and that's exactly what we, to the people of Iraq and Afghanistan, are just pissing away money, are fabulously wealthy. And when they get the opportunity to say what they wanted, a new hospital, even if it was nice things, like we want a new, we spent $1 million on a hospital in this city called Rupa. I mean, it was my unit that went there that did this in 2004, 2005. A year later, in 2006, 2007, I go there. They don't send me back to where I had been the year before, which would have been helpful because I would know the lay of the land. I would know the people, all that. They send me, and the people who were in Rupa are somewhere up far north in Haditha or something like that. And I remember calling my friend to be like, we were supposed to go inspect this hospital you built. Where in the hell is it? You know what I mean? He tries to describe it to me. I'm searching like mad. Like, there's $1 million hospital somewhere. Where did it go? And it took weeks to figure out that, well, it was this old defunct hospital that they just bought some new materials for, and all the materials have been stolen now. New hospital beds, new x-ray machines, stuff like that. And it just all disappeared, But for a while, I was just like going around the city being like, we're supposed to find a hospital. I don't see any hospital that looks like it has $1 million in it, And of course, you ask them for the things that they want, and you give it to them. We have the money, and what can they do with it?
My prediction was I was going to think, oh, they built the hospital, but there were no doctors or nurses to staff the hospital. So, no, It was all stolen. Oh, geez. Well, one more topic, I think. We didn't go. I never asked you this, but did you outline your tours and your experience in your training?
No, I haven't. So, just a quick CV for that. Then I originally, like I said, I grew up in Annapolis, which is a somewhat military town. My whole life, all I wanted to do was be in the military in some capacity. Originally, Top Gun kind of got to me, and I wanted to be a fighter pilot, but my vision wasn't going to allow that. By the time I was in high school. So I settled on becoming a Marine, and because of a book I read by Thomas Ricks called Making the Corps. Then I settled on maybe becoming a Marine officer. So, well, at first I signed up to be security forces, active duty, which is, thankfully, I didn't end up doing that. That's babysitting nukes. And then I switched to going to college and being a reservist in the Marine Corps at this civil affairs unit. I didn't know what civil affairs was, but I was going to do that, maybe deploy once or twice, finish college, and then finish officer candidate school. In the course of that, I went to college for a year at Towson in Maryland, and then was deployed to Fallujah in 2004, came home, went to school for a year, pissed away all the deployment savings on booze, and I was nearly killed on that deployment. I was shot. I got a ricochet in the calf, and the other bullet went over the door and almost hit me in the head. So I kind of thought by my next deployment I might not live. So I bought all my friends booze, and I was really popular for a year in Towson. And then I went back to Iraq in 2006, had kind of a crummy deployment, poor leadership, and kind of was down on the Marine Corps, almost completely quit in 2008. But then there was a prospective deployment to Afghanistan, and basically all my friends were going. And these were my Marines that I was really tight with, and we all kind of, it was like a all-star team, let's say. And so I kind of bucked up and rededicated myself. I re-enlisted. I stayed in. Went to Helmand in Afghanistan, and then came home. At this point, I was pretty much done with things, but I ended up getting deployed one more time to Sangin in northern Helmand, which was a really dangerous spot. And then finally I became a civil affairs instructor. And I worked in Quantico for about 3 years before becoming a true libertarian and renouncing the Marine Corps and going back to and getting a real job.
Well, let's talk about a little bit about your activism now, just so we close things up here. So I think we had talked a little bit about, I can't remember if this was on air or not, sorry.
That's fine.
But what organizations are you kind of involved with?
So the main thing I'm involved with doing, and it is an idea created by the 10th Amendment Center and popularized by a group called by Bring Our Troops Home, called bringourtroopshome.us, is the Defend the Guard Act. You can also find the information about that at defendtheguard.us or 10th Amendment Center. And the idea of that bill, which I think you've covered before, but it's worth retreading, and I might be able to add some interesting value, is the Defend the Guard Act denies the use of the state's National Guard in combat unless a war is declared. So the National Guard can be deployed to places like Estonia for training events or things like that still, but they can't be sent to Iraq or Afghanistan or anywhere where they're going to get combat pay without a declaration of war from Congress, which there is none. That doesn't exist right now. There's no declaration of war. So this would effectively deny about 18,000 Guard members a year that are deployed to CENTCOM, the central command where most of these wars are being conducted. There's about 18,000 a year they depend on. They depend on the aircraft in the Air National Guards, particularly the A-10, if you've heard of that. It's the close air support aircraft. Those are almost exclusively in the National Guard because the Air Force wants to get rid of them in favor of the F-35. And if some states that pass this, it would really it would be an effective way to really put sand in the gears. This isn't just like, a symbolic resistance. It could, if any states that have an A-10 unit pass it, that's why Idaho is one of the places where it has a chance of passing, but the resistance it's getting is that the fact that they have a mission essential aircraft has people up in arms against it. The difference is if a large state, the threat that the government holds against it is that they would punish the state by taking away bases, and the bases that Congress might, instead of actually nutting up and declaring a war like they're constitutionally expected to, might just punish that state for resisting. There's also a threat that it could lose in Supreme Court. It's not entirely clear. I'd love you to look into. There's a case called Perpich versus DOD. That was the last kind of relevant case about deploying the National Guard. And the idea is, but basically, if it's passed, the state's National Guard can't be used. There are real examples, like in Oregon this summer, the firefighting helicopters were sent to Afghanistan in the midst of the blazes from the Army National Guard. During Katrina, That's a famous example where the entire Louisiana National Guard was deployed to Iraq and was unable to respond. So reserve units from other states had to be called in, including some civil affairs Marines from Washington had to be sent down under questionable circumstances, because usually the military isn't supposed to operate in those situations. But the idea is, if this bill gets passed, especially if it gets passed in a large state that could kind of take the hit of 1 or 2 bases being closed, or a state like my own Maryland that has bases they just can't shut down, like Andrews Air Force Base and where Air Force One is, and it has, Fort Meade where the NSA is. They can't shut those down very easily. Then the threat of closing bases is a little mooted. So if a state manages to pass it, it really could make a big dent, about 18,000 soldiers a year that they depend on being taken out off the chessboard. And so people are fighting it. People are trying to get it on the agenda. I'm trying real hard here in Maryland. If anyone is in Maryland, please contact me, because I need more people on my side. Mostly I'm just getting ignored by our state legislators. It's the first thing they do is ignore you. And then hopefully someday I'll get them to fear me. But I'm working on that. And that's my main thing. If anyone takes away, it's get on Defend the Guard. Find somebody in your state to talk to about it. Other than that, organizationally, that's my main to-do. I talk with I'm very ecumenical. I talk with the Vets for Peace chapters, and I'm happy to work with any anti-war voice. Because we really need a pretty broad coalition, I think, to get this over the hump. Last thing, if you don't mind me mentioning, an idea I have is to pretty soon here, I'm going to be trying to put together a podcast of my own that's going to be short stories. So if you had a moment when you were in Iraq, even if you weren't a veteran, but let's say you were a veteran and you were in Iraq and you saw something that made you think this is screwed up, I want to put out like 5-minute emotive pieces that you could share with somebody. I saw this thing and this is how it affected me. Or it could also be a poem you read, or a documentary you saw, something you experienced, anything that anyone experienced that made them think that war needs to end. I want to put together as many of those as I can and have a wide variety of voices and experiences, and that's going to be coming together soon. And I hope, I'll give you a link to share it as soon as I'm going to buy a website this weekend. I'm just waiting for the Cyber Monday deals.
Of course. Of course. Yeah. Well, I'd love to have you on again, because there's so much there. Like, anyway, well, okay.
Yeah.
Well, I'll ask you, since I have you on now, what is your experience? Have you been talking to vets from other wars and experience with that on the home front?
I limited. When I went to the Vets for Peace meetings, there were some Vietnam era veterans there. We didn't really get to talking too much about our experiences. This was in the midst of the Iran thing around January, where Trump had killed Soleimani. So it was more protesting and immediate action. They were actually, the Vets for Peace here were very animated. I mean, they were very animated about Yemen. And we didn't really get to talking about their specific things. They had a long history of activism, actually. It's very funny. Activism seems to be a retirees game, because they were desperate to have me come along to chain myself to the governor's desk in protest of loading. They're great here, which is really nifty idea, was to try to stop arms from being put onto Saudi ships by blockading ports, chaining themselves to the gates of the port facilities whenever the Saudi ships are in port. The problem is we don't know when there's actual arms being put on them and when it's just wheat shipments or whatever. That's a secret information that they wanted to lock themselves to the governor's desk until they could get the manifest for the ship to find out what was going on it. And they wanted me to come along, and I'm like, guys, I've got a job. I can't be arrested tomorrow. So like, good on them, because they really seem to not care about spending a night in jail at the time. But I think we need more creative ideas like that might get a voice out there. And then I think the other thing about that is challenging talking to other veterans is there, and Danny Scherzen is amazing about this because he really stays on message, and just stays on the war message. And he's a very staunch progressive, but there's some people that listen to him and don't even know that necessarily.
I'm one of them.
Yeah. But that's okay because it's really about, we need everyone from all sides, and there's no reason that being anti-war has to be left, right, or center or libertarian issue. It's literally for everyone. There's reasons to oppose these things, and what really is regrettable is the veterans groups all do tend to take, the veterans anti-war groups at least all have a color. They're either the progressive anti-war veterans group or the conservative there's Bring Our Troops Home is the conservative group, and Vets for Peace is the progressive group, and Concerned Veterans is the Koch funded group. And it's we need a bigger tent. We need a group for literally everyone, not just Veterans for Peace. That should be a caucus within a much bigger. I've never understood why they have to. I can understand wanting to have a totalizing worldview as a libertarian, kind of, but at the same time, there's no reason anti-war movements have to carry all the other baggage, So that's one of the kind of, it's unfortunate that we have to choose our flavor in that activism for some reason, or some people behave as though we do, and I really like to try to move past that. So I try to avoid choosing that flavor. For a while, I tried to pretend I wasn't a libertarian, but it's hard to hide that.
Yeah, no kidding. Well, it's the most important issue, Yeah,
it really is. It flies. That's the thing that it's the most important. It should be the most important to me. And I have long conversations with my fiance about this, but to me, it's the most important issue, and I think it should be the most important issue to everyone, certainly to libertarians. I understand there's been this turn because of the lockdowns and stuff like that, and the government is always an immediate threat to us. But there, just as an example, who's going to be administering the vaccines? It's going to be the military, and that's a perfect example of how having this standing army is. Everyone saw that video, that speech saying, we're going to be the ones immunizing you, or I don't know if but having this standing army enables those kinds of encroachments. So even if you think COVID is the biggest issue right now that you need to be fighting against your state's lockdown, well, I got another thing to tell you. The standing army is the biggest issue because they couldn't do this without that implicit threat. And for progressives, there's so many reasons that I can't even, the environmental damage. For libertarians, too, I mean, the murder, the out-and-out 26,000 children have been killed in Afghanistan alone since 2005. We're talking 800,000 civilians killed. 37. The Cost of War Project has 37 million people displaced from their homes and 12 million permanent refugees. All of the food insecurity, all of that are things that really everyone should want to put a stop to, and that are all results of the war. And then, whatever direction you're coming from, I'm convinced it should be your number one issue. The problem is, I've got to hit you on the emotional level. I could throw these numbers at you, but they're not going to count, is what I've found over the last year. And that's why I'm trying to get this thing together where I tell you a story, and I get every friend I can to tell a story about this. I read this poem. I heard about this child that this thing happened to. I saw this thing, and make it short enough that somebody might actually hit play if you send it to them. Because if they see something that's 45 minutes or an hour of you and me telling them all the reasons, it won't happen. They probably won't click play. But if it's short enough, I think I might be able to get you to hit play and be like, damn, that's fucked up. That happened. So that's my hope, is to get something like that off the ground.
Well, that's a wonderful idea, and I should let you get to it. But I'm going to put all the links to this. That's again at libertyweekly.net/42. And I would really recommend that the audience go and check out your work and keep an eye open for your project. And I'd love to have you back on once you get that launched,
Yeah, I've got a few sort of scripts, like 2 kind of written, a few outlined. I need to get the webpage, buy the audio stuff, get some Christmas deals, and then I'm hoping to launch by Christmas, because one of the things that makes me cry every year is watching the match. It's one of my weird, sick, self-flagellating Christmas traditions is to watch the MASH Christmas episode where a father dies and they try to keep him alive so he doesn't die on Christmas. And then they sing. I remember this was this will be one of my first episodes. Is this moment where I hear where they start. I was a little kid when I saw this show, but it was it was weird to me because I revered the military and all those things, but MASH is a little bit irreverent, and it was very strange to me to see them all crying. And I didn't know Latin at the time, but my father was he was an altar boy, and I asked him, and they were singing Dona Nobis Pacem, give us peace. And I was really confused why these soldiers were singing give us peace. That was when I was very young that I saw that, and it was one of those first moments where I realized you could be in uniform and think differently, and so that's what I'm hoping to get out soon to y'all.
Awesome. Mine is the World War I Christmas story, the ceasefire.
Yeah. That's great. That's I want everyone. Have you seen that movie Joyeux Noël?
Yeah. That's a great movie.
I think everyone in our world probably has one, maybe dozens, maybe at least a few. So I might try to get people on. Yeah. I want everyone to tell me their little story, their little moment, their thing that just kind of hit them in the heart in the right time. So I'm excited about this.
Yeah. Well, you should be. Me too. Yeah. And so, well, I really appreciate you reaching out to me, Scott. And hopefully we'll talk more in the future. And I wish you best of luck.
Thanks, Patrick. I really appreciate it. Thanks for everything.
Of course.